Prior to Thor Ragnarok, the God of Thunder appeared in 4 Marvel films. The first Thor, the first Avengers, Thor the Dark World, and Avengers Age of Ultron. And with each subsequent appearance, the studio seemed less and less sure what to do with the character, to the point that they just excluded him completely from Civil War, which really is a shame because to start out with Kenneth Branagh's first film, they seem to have settled on a character and a tone that not only worked on his own, but also very successfully made way for maximum contrast to the rest of the Avengers. Unfortunately, and I do feel like nearly every one of the Marvel sequels has struggled with this to a certain extent, perhaps Captain America being the only exception, but most of our MCU leads, after completing their most interesting and dynamic character arc in their first film, are really left to tread water. For Thor, in his first film, he went from arrogance to humility, immaturity to maturity, which really was quite solid. But where do you go next? And unfortunately, both Thor the Dark World and Avengers Age of Ultron seem to prove that Marvel Studios, anyways, didn't really know. And so, even before it was announced that the studio had chosen to give this third Thor film to the extremely quirky filmmaker Taika Waititi, I was already assuming that the character was about to undergo some fairly significant changes. And indeed, every trailer and every interview with cast and crew seemed to confirm my suspicions. As such, what I desperately wanted to see going into this film was, could the filmmakers bridge that gap? Could they create a film that felt both fresh, alive, and new for those who had stopped or never had connected with the character, and also feel respectful and consistent for those who had? Those who were still invested in who and what had been established as the MCU's Thor. Well, before we discuss how successful or not successful the filmmakers were in creating that bridge, in creating a film that could allow the old to congeal with the new, let's just assess how successful they were at creating a good film. And for my money, looking at this film on its own, I would say, yeah, they were pretty successful. From the very first scene, from the very first line, it was very clear that the filmmakers were endeavoring to make a light, colorful, genuinely laugh-out-loud comedy that had some action-adventure mixed into it. And for the most part, they were successful in that endeavor. I and the rest of my theater were laughing often and hard throughout this film. And because of that tone, I really did feel like I could see the actors just coming to life in these characters. Chris Hemsworth, Mark Ruffalo, and Jeff Goldblum especially were just clearly there to play. And even if they did often approach, if not just wholly embrace, caricature, there was no denying that they were clearly just having fun and wanting us to join in with that. Especially in watching Hulk, it was extremely delightful to actually see Ruffalo coming through that CG creation. The film's director, Taika Waititi, was also clearly in his element with this film. Beyond giving his actors license to just be free, he boldly put his stamp on this universe visually as well, having his team design sets that were unabashedly straight out of the 70s and 80s low-budget sci-fi genre, and judging that decision purely on its freshness, they were a lot of fun. And my concerns that this film would simply attempt to ape the financially more successful Guardians of the Galaxy film, just mimicking those films' comedy and music, was for the most part shown to be unfounded. Visually and tonally, Thor Ragnarok really did belong to this group of filmmakers, and even in the moments where it did come close to quote-unquote doing what the Guardians had done, it did provide its own unique spin on things. For example, in 2 key scenes that, in my opinion, were far and away the best action sequences in the film, a Led Zeppelin song was utilized, which, to me, felt very fitting for this film and its version of Thor. I should mention, too, that this film wasn't just wall-to-wall, almost fourth-wall breaking comedy. No, there were numerous times that it dipped into sincerity and earnestness that helped to ground the characters, if only just a little. And ultimately, I will always be a fan of seeing filmmakers able to do their thing, be themselves, and make a film that is uniquely theirs and no one else's. And for the most part, I felt like Mr. Waititi was able to do just that. Even while the first 30 minutes or so were dedicated to tidying up the cliffhanger at the end of Thor the Dark World, for the most part this film really did feel like it belonged to that filmmaker. Something else that made this film work as well as it did, and again I'm looking purely at this film on its own, was I could tell that those involved in it did actually like the character of Thor. Though they never missed a moment to poke fun at his large Shakespearean tendencies, they did so in love, not trying to belittle the essence of the character found in the comic books. Now, whether the film was belittling to the characters seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, well, that might be a different story altogether. If you went into this film ready for the next quote-unquote episode in the MCU, ready to follow the continuing adventures of one of its main protagonists, a character who had been presented with utmost sincerity and earnestness, Well, you may well be slightly confused. Don't get me wrong, there were indeed moments that the director and actors were almost magically able to marry their new comedic tone with what had been seen previously. But for the most part, I did feel like we were entering a brand new universe. In fact, there was more than once where we completely ceased to be presented with the character of Thor at all, shown instead Chris Hemsworth, the actor, playing Thor. Another challenge that I had with this film was actually appreciating the characters that were set up strong in the opening minutes of the film, presented as interesting and potentially very powerful, only to have them pretty much just sit around for the rest of the film. Of the main characters, Cate Blanchett's Hela seemed to suffer most in this regard. Some very important information about who she was in relation to the rest of the MCU was dropped very early on in the film, and then ultimately used in no important way going forward, having barely any bearing on any of the events from that point on. Instead, she was just confined to one location, made to simply strike an evil pose, deliver an evil line, and so forth, while the rest of the cast was off on their own separate comedy adventure. What bothered me most about her character, and indeed a few other elements in this film as well, was that she seemed to be a direct response to some of the criticisms leveled at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, those being, why are the villains always so weak, and how many world-ending disasters can our heroes really stop? But the problem was, though the filmmakers attempted to switch things up, getting us to invest in the villain, etc., etc., the rest of the formula remained so firmly in place, so overtly pronounced, and those new twists and turns so uncaringly presented, that the film as a whole ultimately ended up feeling like more of the same. At the end of the day, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is now 17 films long, which is a lot of films, and as such, it's completely understandable that we, the viewer, and the filmmakers behind these films will eventually have to ask, why continue to make the same film over and over? And yes, that is a very healthy question to ask. But another, perhaps more important question to ask is it worth pushing things so far that it might undermine the investment and connection the fans have to what's come previously? Well, I think each of us need to answer that question for ourselves, but for me, I just felt like Thor Ragnarok pushed it just a little too far. Nonetheless, I will still give the film a 3 out of 5 and a heart, because Taika Waititi is just hilarious, and seeing Chris Hemsworth just having fun with this role, kind of for the very first time in the actual franchise, is just a great delight. As I always ask every single time a new MCU film comes out though, could you guys please rank the Marvel Cinematic Universe films for me? I love seeing your guys' lists. They're fascinating to me. Finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.